Before we speak of the man who changed history, we must first understand the world he was born into. Because the story of 1453 is not simply the story of a siege. It is the story of what happens when power is held by people who love only themselves, and what becomes possible when it is taken by someone who answers to something greater. The Byzantine Empire, in the final decades of its existence, was not destroyed from the outside. It was hollowed out from within long before any Ottoman soldier stood before its walls. The Byzantine historian Dukas, writing in his chronicle Historia Byzantina, one of the most candid primary accounts of the empire's collapse, describes an imperial court consumed by a century of civil wars, rival dynasties, and an aristocracy more interested in preserving its own wealth and privileges than in defending the civilization it claimed to represent. Dukas documents how Byzantine emperors in the 14th and early 15th centuries spent more energy fighting each other for the throne than they ever spent fighting the empire's enemies. Entire provinces were bargained away. The treasury was emptied, funding internal power struggles. The army was neglected. The city walls were left to slowly deteriorate, while the noble families of Constantinople built themselves ever more elaborate palaces within them. The Western Christian powers, the kingdoms and republics that shared Constantinople's faith and claimed to share its values, watched this disintegration with something closer to calculation than concern. Venice and Genoa, the great trading republics of the era, were more interested in their commercial privileges inside Constantinople than in its survival as a civilization. The historian Stephen Runciman, in his definitive scholarly study, The Fall of Constantinople, 1453, documents how Venice and Genoa actually had competing trading colonies inside the city simultaneously, and how these two Christian powers spent considerable energy undermining each other's commercial interests while the empire around them crumbled. Trade came before faith, profit came before solidarity. The papacy in Rome had its own calculation. Pope Nicholas V and his predecessors had been willing to send military help to Constantinople, but only if the Eastern Orthodox Church submitted to the authority of Rome and accepted the supremacy of the Pope. This was the price of salvation. The Byzantine clergy, for their part, were bitterly divided over this question, some willing to accept union with Rome to gain military help, others considering Roman submission a worse fate than Ottoman conquest. Dukas records the famous words attributed to the Byzantine Grand Duke Loukas Notaras, who reportedly declared that he would rather see the turban of the Sultan in Constantinople than the cardinal's hat of Rome. Whether or not the exact words are precisely attributed, Runciman notes the uncertainty around them. They captured a genuine sentiment that ran through a significant portion of the Byzantine ruling class. A world that could not unite around anything except its own divisions was a world already lost. This was the civilization Mehmet II looked at from the other side of the Bosphorus. Fractured, exhausted, abandoned by its allies, led by men who had spent generations choosing personal advantage over collective survival. And he drew the conclusion that a young man of extraordinary clarity will always draw when he looks at a decaying order, that its time had come, and that someone with the vision and the will to replace it had not just the power, but the obligation to do so. In
The Ottoman city of
1432,
Amasya.
in the provincial Ottoman city of Amasya, Mehmet II was born. He was the third son of Sultan Murad II, which, in the brutal inheritance politics of the Ottoman court, meant he was an inconvenience, a spare, a child dispatched to the provinces with tutors and servants while his father's attention went elsewhere. The court expected nothing from him. They could not have been more wrong. Tursun Beg, the Ottoman court historian and chronicler who knew Mehmet personally and recorded his life in the primary source Tariq-i-Ebul Feth, the history of the father of conquest, describes a young man whose mind operated on a different level from everyone around him. While the children of the Byzantine aristocracy were raised in a culture of entitlement and factional maneuvering, Mehmet studied in 6 languages: Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. He read military strategy and ancient history with equal attention. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, the sieges of ancient commanders, the geography of every territory he intended one day to govern. Tursun Beg writes that Mehmet approached knowledge the way a general approaches a campaign, systematically, purposefully, and always in service of an end goal. That end goal, from very early in his life, was Constantinople, not because he had been told to want it, but because he had studied the world carefully enough to understand what it meant. Constantinople sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling the strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, positioned at the geographic heart of the known world. As long as it remained in the hands of a dying empire, propped up by squabbling Western powers, the entire region existed in a state of unstable uncertainty, neither fully governed nor fully free, neither protected nor surrendered, simply decaying in the hands of people who lacked the strength to hold it and the wisdom to release it. Mehmet understood with the clarity of a young man unclouded by inherited assumptions that this could not continue. When Sultan Murad II died in 1451 and Mehmet took the Ottoman throne at 19 years old, the courts of Europe responded with the particular condescension of people who mistake youth for weakness. The Venetian ambassador reported home that the new sultan was young and inexperienced. The Byzantine court sent a delegation to congratulate him and, according to Dukas in Historia Byzantina, used the meeting to hint at their ability to support rival Ottoman claimants to the throne, a barely veiled threat designed to keep Mehmet manageable. It was the move of a court that had survived by playing factions against each other for so long that it could no longer conceive of dealing with someone who was not interested in being played. Mehmet received the Byzantine delegation, listened to their hints, and said nothing. Then he went home and began preparing the conquest of their city. The contrast between what Mehmet was building and what his enemies were doing in the same years tells you everything about why history turned the way it did. While the Byzantine court was paralyzed by its theological debates about whether to accept Roman authority in exchange for military help, a debate that Runciman in The Fall of Constantinople 1453 describes as consuming enormous political energy while producing nothing militarily useful, Mehmet was moving with absolute focus. In 1452, he ordered the construction of Rumeli Hisar, a massive fortress on the European bank of the Bosphorus Strait. Critobulus of Imbros, who documented Mehmet's reign in his biography, History of Mehmet the Conqueror, writing with the measured candor of a Greek subject who came to respect the man who conquered his world, records that the fortress was completed in 4 months. 4 months. A construction project that military engineers of the era estimated should take years, completed in a single season through the force of Mehmet's organizational will and the discipline of an army that understood its mission. While Emperor Constantine XI was writing letters to Venice that produced sympathy and almost no soldiers, Runciman documents that the total Western military contribution to the defense of Constantinople amounted to fewer than 1,000 men, a figure that stands as one of the damning indictments of Christian solidarity in the historical record. Mehmet was solving the specific problem of how to bring down walls that had never been brought down. The solution came through a Hungarian engineer named Urban. Critobulus records that Urban first approached Constantinople offering to build an artillery piece of unprecedented scale.
Constantine's treasury, depleted by generations of misrule and civil conflict, could not meet his price. Urban came to Mehmet. Tursun Beg records in Tariq-i-Ebul Feth that Mehmet met Urban personally, questioned him directly about what he could build, and immediately gave him the resources, the workforce, and the time he needed without hesitation or bureaucratic delay. This was the difference between a decaying system and a functioning one, not the availability of the engineer, but the decisiveness of the leader. Urban existed in the world before 1452. Only one ruler was capable of actually using him. The cannon Urban produced under Mehmet's patronage was 27 feet in length and fired stone projectiles weighing over 1,200 pounds. Critobulus describes it in precise technical detail in History of Mehmet the Conqueror. When it was test-fired near Edirne, the sound carried 14 miles, and the impact buried the cannonball several feet into the earth. The walls of Constantinople, built in an era before gunpowder existed, had met their answer. Not because the West had built something new,
because Mehmet had. He assembled his army in the spring of 1453. Critobulus estimates the force at between 60,000 and 80,000 men, disciplined, supplied, organized, and commanded with a clarity of purpose that the defenders behind their ancient walls could not match. Mehmet was 19 when he took power. He was 20 when he began this campaign. He moved like a man who had been preparing for this his entire life, because he had. The siege began on April 6, 1453, and it revealed day by day the character of everyone involved. The Byzantine defenders, outnumbered, abandoned, and exhausted, fought with a courage that their political leaders had never deserved. George Franzes, the emperor's personal secretary who recorded the siege in his memoir Chronicon Minus, the most intimate eyewitness account that survives, describes ordinary soldiers and civilians working through every night to repair what the cannon destroyed every day. Women and priests carried stones alongside soldiers. Monks filled breaches in walls. People who had been given no reason to believe their leaders and every reason to surrender instead chose to fight. Franzes records this without sentimentality and without explanation. He simply documents what he saw. A population that had been failed by its ruling class and fought anyway, out of something that transcended political calculation. Mehmet watched this from across the walls with respect. Critobulus, whose account is notable for its lack of triumphalism, given that it was written for Mehmet's court, records that the Sultan several times offered terms to the city, offering to allow the population to remain, to preserve their lives, their churches, and their property, if Constantine would surrender peacefully. Constantine refused. He had made his choice on the night he dismissed the census numbers and decided to die with his city rather than submit. Franzes does not judge this decision. He records it with the quiet dignity of a man who made the same choice himself. The Ottoman naval failure of April 20th, when 4 Christian supply ships fought through the entire Ottoman fleet and reached the harbor, produced in Mehmet something that revealed his nature more than any victory could. Critobulus describes him riding his horse into the water at the shore in fury, screaming at his naval commanders. He was 21 years old, and he was learning, publicly, that his fleet was not good enough. A lesser man would have concealed this or rationalized it. Mehmet turned it into one of the most remarkable military engineering operations in medieval history. He ordered 70 ships transported overland. Critobulus documents the operation in History of Mehmet the Conqueror, a road of greased wooden rollers built across the hills of Galata. Ships dragged up and over and down into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain that protected the harbor entrance, completed in a single night. When the Byzantine defenders woke on April 22nd, there were Ottoman warships inside their harbor. Runciman, in The Fall of Constantinople 1453, describes this as one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering of the entire medieval period. It was also something more than that. It was the response of a man who refused to let his own limitations become permanent. He encountered a problem, admitted it, and solved it in a way no one had thought possible. Inside the city, the political failures that had doomed Constantinople continued until the very end. The Venetian and Genoese communities inside the walls spent part of the siege in disputes about their respective obligations and privileges.
The theological faction that opposed any compromise with Rome continued agitating even as the cannon fired. Ducas records with barely concealed bitterness that certain members of the Byzantine nobility were more concerned about the political implications of accepting Western help than with the practical implications of not receiving it. A civilization that had governed itself through faction and self-interest for generations could not transform itself into a unified fighting force in 53 days. On the evening of May 28th, the 52nd day of the siege, something happened on both sides of the walls that captures the moral distance between two worlds. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI ordered a final procession through the city. Franzes, who walked in it, describes it in Chronicon Minus as the most moving thing he ever witnessed. Every Christian in the city, Orthodox and Catholic, Venetian and Genoese, people who had been arguing about theology while the walls were being broken, walked together through the streets for the first and last time. They carried icons. They sang. They stopped at every church. Soldiers who had not prayed in years knelt in the streets. The city had been failed by its leaders, abandoned by its allies, and reduced to a ghost of what it had once been, and in its final hours, it found a unity it had never managed in the years when unity might have saved it. Constantine addressed his commanders in what Franzes records as a speech of extraordinary dignity. He told them they were the last defenders of 11 centuries of civilization. He asked forgiveness from anyone he had wronged. He embraced every man in the room. Then he went alone to Hagia Sophia and prayed for the last time. Franzes tried to follow him and found he could not. He stood outside the great church, listening to the emperor pray inside it, and understood, as he writes in Chronicon Minus, that he was witnessing the end of a world. Outside the walls, Mehmet moved through his camp personally. Tursun Beg records in Tariq-i-Ibn Fet that the Sultan visited his soldiers tent by tent, speaking to them directly, reminding them of what they were about to do and why it mattered. He did not speak of treasure or conquest. Tursun Beg records that Mehmet spoke to his men about governance, about the responsibility that comes with victory, about how they would treat the people of the city, about the kind of rule they were about to establish in a place that had been ruled badly for too long. He told them the city would be theirs. He told them it would be governed justly. He gave his final orders. 3 waves. The assault before dawn. At 1:30 in the morning of May 29, 1453, the final assault began. The first 2 waves broke against the walls and absorbed enormous casualties. Critobulus is honest about Ottoman losses in history of Mehmet the Conqueror. This was not a clean victory. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of people who had nothing left to lose. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, held the critical breach in the Blacherna section through sheer force of will, and Ducas credits him directly with the survival of the defense through the night. Giustiniani fell, struck by a projectile whose exact nature the sources disagree on, a discrepancy Runciman notes in The Fall of Constantinople 1453. He asked Constantine for permission to withdraw for treatment. Franzes records that Constantine begged him to stay, telling him directly that his departure would end everything. Giustiniani left. The breach wavered. Space appeared. The Janissaries moved. Mehmet's elite infantry, professional soldiers trained for exactly this moment, held back through the entire night precisely so they would be fresh when everyone else was exhausted, struck the weakened defense with everything they had. Critobulus records the names of the first men over the walls. Through a small, unlocked gate, the Kirkopa Porta, left open in the chaos of the night according to Ducas, soldiers entered the city from the inside while the assault continued from the outside. The defense had no answer to 2 simultaneous directions. Constantine XI tore off his imperial regalia. Franzes, separated from him in the final chaos, records that the emperor was last seen throwing himself into the fighting near the breach, not fleeing, not surrendering, but fighting as a soldier. He died there. His body was never definitively found. Runciman concludes in The Fall of Constantinople 1453 that Constantine died in those final minutes in close quarters combat. The last emperor of Rome, dying with a sword in his hand, paying in his own blood for the failures of the system he inherited and never had the time or resources to fix. He deserved better than what history gave him to work with. He faced it without flinching anyway. By sunrise, the city had fallen. This is the part of the story that is most often forgotten, because conquest is easy to document. What comes after conquest reveals everything about the man who won. Mehmet II rode into Constantinople on a white horse in the morning of May 29th. He was 21 years old. Critobulus records in History of Mehmet the Conqueror that his first act was to ride directly to Hagia Sophia, where thousands of civilians had locked themselves inside and were waiting to learn their fate. Mehmet ordered the doors opened. He ordered that no one inside be harmed. He dismounted, poured a handful of earth over his head in a gesture of humility before God, recorded by Critobulus, and walked inside. He stood beneath the dome and wept. The detail is recorded independently in Critobulus in the Venetian surgeon Niccolò Barbaro's Diary of the Siege of Constantinople, an eyewitness account written during the siege itself, and in later Ottoman court records. A young man of 21 who had just accomplished what no commander in 11 centuries had managed, standing beneath the greatest architectural achievement of the civilization he had just defeated and weeping. Critobulus does not explain the tears, he simply records them. They may have contained everything: grief for what had been lost, awe at what stood around him, the weight of what he had done, and the knowledge of what he now owed to history. He immediately issued orders governing the treatment of the city's population. Critobulus and Tursun Beg both document that Mehmet forbade the destruction of the city's civilian infrastructure, prohibited the harming of those who had not taken up arms, and began almost immediately planning the repopulation and rebuilding of Constantinople as the new Ottoman capital. He invited Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities to settle in the city. He appointed a new Greek Orthodox Patriarch, Gennadios Scholarios, and guaranteed the continuation of the Orthodox Church under Ottoman protection, a policy documented by the church historian Gennadios himself. The church that had been abandoned by the Western powers that claimed to be its protectors was preserved by the Muslim Sultan who had just defeated it. Runciman, in The Fall of Constantinople 1453, describes Mehmet's governance of the conquered city as genuinely remarkable in its relative tolerance and administrative competence, particularly when contrasted with the chaos that typically followed medieval conquest. The people of Constantinople had lived under a government paralyzed by faction, abandoned by their Christian allies, and unable to protect them from anything. What replaced it was order. Imperfect, foreign, and imposed by force, but order nonetheless. Mehmet declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome.
He was not burning the Roman legacy. He was claiming it, as Runciman analyzes in The Fall of Constantinople 1453. He spent the rest of his reign rebuilding the city, establishing institutions, commissioning art and architecture, inviting scholars from across the Islamic and Christian worlds to his court. He conquered 12 more kingdoms and over 200 cities before his death in 1481. He governed them with the same combination of absolute will and genuine administrative seriousness that he had shown since the day he took the Ottoman throne. He was not perfect, no ruler is, but he was something genuinely rare in the history of power, a man who wanted it not for its own sake, but for what he believed he could do with it. Edward Gibbon, in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published between 1776 and 1789, and still among the most important works of historical scholarship ever written, marks May 29, 1453 as the true end of the ancient world. The Eastern Roman Empire, the direct institutional continuation of the Rome of Augustus and Constantine the Great, ceased to exist after 1,123 unbroken years. Not because it was destroyed by a superior civilization, because it destroyed itself through greed, faction, and the consistent elevation of personal advantage over collective responsibility. And a superior leader stepped into the space it left. Stephen Runciman, in The Fall of Constantinople 1453, documents the consequences that radiated outward from that single morning. Greek scholars fled westward carrying ancient manuscripts preserved in Byzantine libraries, texts that directly accelerated the Italian Renaissance. The disruption of Eastern trade routes pushed European navigators to find sea routes to Asia. Columbus sailed west in 1492.
Istanbul today.
Vasco da Gama
The city that was
rounded
Constantinople,
Africa in
that was Byzantium, the
1498.
same opera.
The modern world, for better and worse, was partly shaped by what happened on one morning in May in a city on the edge of two continents. The walls that had protected a decaying order for 1,100 years fell not because they were weak, but because the system behind them had rotted beyond recovery.
They fell to a young man who had spent his entire life preparing to replace that rotted order with something governed by discipline, vision, and purpose. History does not wait for the comfortable or the entitled. It moves toward those who are ready for it. Mehmet II was 21 years old when he conquered the last city of an ancient world. He wept when he stood inside it. Then he got to work rebuilding it. Al-Fatih, the conqueror, the man who ended one world and built another in its place.